Everything you need to answer the call to do more with your life is already within you. I believe, and it's my experience, that we access this through connecting with our innate creativity. But just what do I mean by that phrase, innate creativity? I'm going to explain that in this video. Creativity is a huge word with many definitions, many connotations. I'm going to give a definition here that is going to work for this framework and explain exactly what I mean by that. Our innate creativity is our unique combination of our skills, our passions, our experience and our gifts. And what we do with these, how we combine these and how we express these to communicate with others. So that's basically what I mean by our innate creativity. Now the origin of the word create is to form out of nothing. We start with a blank canvas or a blank page of paper, and that's the place really to start this exercise with that blank space. And into the mix we add our passions, our skills, our experience, our gifts, and then we express these. So that's what I mean by that. Now I believe it's our purpose here on earth and in this body to create something, to create or to procreate. That is how we leave our legacy, and that's how we transcend time, by creating something of value or by procreating and reproducing. So that gives you an idea. Now let me tell you about how this has worked for me in my life. Now let's start with my passions, and start with when I look back on to childhood and look at the activities that I really enjoyed and the things that really took me out of myself and engrossed me when I was a child. Now those things are reading and ballet. I was the kind of child I constantly had my head in a book, and I'm really passionate about reading these days. I'm one of these people who's got a pile of books that never gets any shorter and is never going to get read, to be honest, but I just love having it. And so actually I stopped reading, and I stopped doing ballet when I was about 11 because it wasn't cool, which is a shame. And I stopped reading probably in my late teens, early 20s, but I came back to these activities later in life. Well, I came back to reading later in life, and when I came back to reading and got my nose in a book, it just felt like that comfort. It almost felt like coming home to me. That's the comfort of sitting with a book is just such a fantastic activity for me. I love it. And I didn't go back to ballet, but what I did start was yoga. Now, in some ways it's quite a similar exercise because using the body and the stretching. And for me, when I started doing yoga, that also felt like coming home. And I came back to these activities, and I believe it was these things that kind of really led me on to doing something a little bit more with my life. I didn't come back to them with that intention, but I think that's what it led me towards. Now, I was reading, I was quite interested in history, and so I was reading historical fiction, but also reading history. And reading history led me on to being interested in politics, because I believe that politics is history in the making. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk about politics, just giving you a picture here of how things build up. And I was going to yoga, and I started to kind of really getting engrossed in those activities. Those started to develop and started to build up, and I started to think about, well, maybe there's something more I can do with my life. And that's when I went to train as a life coach. Now, I qualified as a life coach just about 2 years ago now, and upon qualification I was working with a business coach who was also my yoga teacher, and we were working, she was working with the principles of yoga philosophy, which I'm also going to come back and talk a little bit more about. She was really good at getting me to really connect with what it was that I had to offer that was of value. Now, I believe that this is the best question to start this exercise off with, connecting with your passions and your gifts, but asking that question, what is it that I've got to offer that is of real value? And this is what got me on to writing my book, Your Whole Life Economy, which I talked about in my last episode. Now, when I sat down to write that, I talk about expression, don't I? So the way I was comfortable with expressing myself at that time was through writing. Now obviously I'm doing this YouTube channel and that's how I'm expressing my creativity, but at the time it was writing. And I sat down and started writing, and I said before I didn't set out to write a book, but the book emerged. And later on in this kind of framework, I talk about how being creative, about being in our flow, and I really experienced that when I started to sit down and started to write this book. It started to flow through me, and it was a really fantastic experience. And that book only took actually 5 weeks to write the first draft, and that was where I really experienced that, connecting with all of this stuff. Now, gifts. What do I mean by gifts? I believe everybody has a gift to offer. Now, the only thing is that it might be quite difficult for you to recognise, because the thing is our gifts are things that come to us quite easily, and often things that come to us easily we don't recognise or we just take for granted. Now, I believe my gift is in creating structures. I think in another life I might have been an architect or something like that, but anyway, I'm not. But when I talk about creating structures, what I actually mean by that is when I look back at my time working in businesses and creating databases, that was about creating structures. It was about taking a pile of data and creating structure out of it and making meaning. And then when I sat down to write this book and started to think about our resources, I created this framework of your whole life economy, which is these 7 personal resources. It was a structure. And when I started to think about this YouTube channel, I started to think about my experience, and that came out in this structure of these 9 phases. And I believe this is just a natural ability of mine to create structures. I actually believe this ability comes from probably growing up in quite chaotic circumstances and my need at the time to try and create some order, and that is how that's developed. Now, so that's another thing that can kind of give us our experiences and give us our talents, is our limitations and our challenges. So that was obviously, growing up in a chaotic environment created this desire for structure for me. But I've got another example of this. In 2011, I discovered that I was suffering with what it's called a neurophysiological disorder, which means that there's an element of it, it centres in the brain, but there is a physiological reaction. This disorder is called misophonia, and it manifests as a sound sensitivity condition. I've been suffering with this since I was 11, but I only realised in 2011 that it was an actual condition. And when I found that out, I started to become really interested in the brain, and particularly neuroplasticity, which is the properties of the brain to be able to change our brain, and I became quite passionate about that. Now, my interest in neuroscience has developed, and that's something that I've actually started to bring into, I brought into my coaching practice, and I work with my clients. And so I'm going to be talking about neuroscience and introducing you to some of the people who've inspired me along the way, and that's where this is going to get really interesting. There's also things that I've tried out that haven't really worked. Now, about a year ago, I became quite interested in Reiki, and I went on a Reiki course. I've got a friend who's quite a gifted Reiki practitioner, and she did some treatments on me and got quite interested. So I went on a Reiki course thinking this was something that I could use. Did this weekend course, came home, did some treatments on myself, did some treatments on the dog, but it wasn't really something that's, really connected with me or brought out a passion. So I put that to one side and I leave that to my friend who's really good at that. So, but it all came from that place of asking what it is that I have to offer that is of value. Now, I hope that gives you a little bit of insight into what I mean by that. I could probably rattle on for ages about this subject, and I'm sure I'll come back to it. But in the next video, I'm going to talk about the neuroscience of creativity, and I'm going to introduce you to one of the neuroscientists who has inspired me. So I hope you'll join me for that.